Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Vendor Risk Scenarios That May Haunt You. Today's speaker is Matt Cherian. Matt Cherian is Director of Products at BitSight, where he leads product development and customer operations. Prior to joining BitSight at an early stage, Matt was head of product and co-founder at Healthify Me, a health and wellness startup. He has more than 10 years of experience in the technology sector, ranging from startups to public sector organizations. Matt holds graduate degrees in computer science and technology and policy from MIT, as well as an undergraduate degree in electrical engineering from Johns Hopkins University. It's my pleasure to now turn it over to Matt.
Thanks, Noah. So today we're going to talk about a few common vendor risk scenarios that you should worry about as an organization. As far as the agenda goes, we're going to actually start with defining vendor risk because some of you in the audience today may not be fully aware of what vendor risk is. And then we will get into those scenarios that we already talked about. And then followed by that, we will go into a number of ways in which you can gain visibility into your vendors and identify the risks that are associated with them. And then we will open it up for Q&A. So all along the presentation today, you have the opportunity to submit questions through the tool that you're using for this webinar. So go ahead and submit questions during the presentation so that we can answer them towards the end. So let's start with defining vendor risk management, and vendor risk will be defined as part of that. So vendor risk management is also known as third-party risk management or supply chain risk management. And depending on the industry that we're talking about, it has been in existence for a couple of decades. In other industries, it may be only a few years. And basically, this is a process of ensuring that your third-party service providers or your vendors, including IT suppliers, are not posing an unacceptable potential for business disruption to your organizational capabilities. And this is important because increasingly more and more critical functions of the enterprise is being outsourced and the dependency on third parties are increasing. So it's important to make sure that companies stay ahead of the risk that the third parties pose to their organizations. And when we talk about risks, third parties can pose a number of different types of risk. So this can be financial risk, legal, operational, geographical, political. Those are some of the ones that have been traditionally tracked in the vendor risk space. But increasingly, cybersecurity has become a risk in this space as well, and that will become clear in our next slide. That's because a lot of breaches over the past 2 to 3 years have happened through third parties of important organizations. So these are some of the companies that have suffered breaches that emanated at third parties, so Wendy's, Experian, and the others that you see here. And the most famous one is probably Target, where the breach happened through the HVAC vendor that they had contracted. And it's not just the risks and the organizational downsides that can emanate from the risks that you need to worry about. Increasingly, regulators are focusing on third-party risk as well. And when we look across different industries, certainly the financial regulators are the leaders in addressing third-party risk and putting in controls for companies to follow in terms of third-party risk. But we're also seeing that a lot of other regulators in other industries are also following suit. There are certainly new requirements. So outside of finance, you see this in defense, retail, healthcare, and the electric sector. For instance, the FERC introduced new rules in July 2016, a few months ago, for supply chain risk management in the electric sector. And regulators are not just putting in requirements, but they're also pursuing enforcement actions on companies for failing to appropriately implement third-party risk management programs. So with that, let's get into the 4 risks that we promised you at the beginning. So we're going to today talk about these 4 scenarios that could potentially haunt you as an organization. So one is, you've onboarded a new vendor and they have poor security hygiene. and by security here we mean IT security. And the second one is your vendor security performance doesn't match what the assessment told you. So typically when a new vendor is coming on board, you might have had that vendor fill out a questionnaire or another type of assessment giving you the state of various processes that exist at the vendor. And the security performance could actually be different from what the assessments are telling you. Another one is your vendor is really slow to remediate security issues. So as people who work in security, we know that issues do come up. There isn't really an organization out there that doesn't have any security issues, but obviously the organization can control how quickly they're responding to and remediating issues. So that's an important aspect. And the last one is, breaches do happen, as we saw in a couple of slides back. So when a breach happens or a similar security incident happens, does the vendor notify you? Because if the vendor didn't notify you, you don't have any visibility into the potential negative implications of that breach on your own organization. So we're going to cover these 4 items in detail in the upcoming slides. So in the first one, if your vendor has poor security hygiene, so one way you can get on top of this is during the vendor selection process or the RFP process, you can do a comprehensive assessment to understand what the vendor security posture is at that point in time. And if a vendor is lacking in security and you have made the decision to go forward with that vendor, what you could do is you could put the vendor on something similar to a performance improvement plan so that they continue to improve on their security, and you make that plan a requirement for the vendor continuing to having your business. Another thing is after that first assessment, you could continuously monitor that vendor security performance. So we know that assessments and other types of audits have point-in-time visibility, but they don't give you that ongoing visibility. So using continuous monitoring to stay on top of the vendor security posture even after the vendor gets onboarded is a good way to make sure that the vendor isn't posing a threat to you. And the stuff you see on the right here is a way in which you can do it using BitSight. We have a security rating that goes from 250 to 900, and using this rating to track the vendor's security posture on an ongoing basis, you can stay on top of changes to that vendor security posture. So another scenario is, security performance doesn't match the assessment results, right? So this is where you've gotten an assessment back, and the vendor seems to check out on various aspects that were covered in the assessment, but an alternate approach, such as the BitSight security rating, tells you something different. So in this case, what you should do is to ensure that you have language in your contract with the vendor before you onboard them to make sure that they're going to stay current on various security measures, and that there is a baseline standard for security performance that the vendor should adhere to on an ongoing basis. And again, monitoring security over time will make sure that whatever deviations from that assessment existed originally, those deviations are minimized over time. And this is a good segue to talking a little bit about assessments and questionnaires. So those are excellent practices that exist in the industry today, and there are many regulators that compel you to have your vendors complete questionnaires and in some cases undergo audits. But neither of those approaches give you an ongoing view into a dynamic environment, and security is certainly very dynamic in nature, and doing assessments alone that are point in time won't give you that continuous visibility. And also, by doing assessments, you're really following the approach of trust but not verifying. So it's an old adage in the IT security space that you should trust but that you should also verify. By following, by using something like BitSight to complement your assessment process, you can basically trust the vendor, but at the same time verify, perhaps select controls or select vendors within your vendor ecosystem. And the last thing to note here is that there are significant costs to filling out and responding to questionnaires. So the cost is not just on the vendor to respond to the questionnaires. There certainly needs to be people on your end to go through the questionnaires and go back to the vendor with follow-ups and so on. And the last metric that you see here is really important because even though a lot of companies follow point-in-time assessments and audits, they do recognize themselves that there's an over-reliance on assessment, and 44% of companies did cite this over-reliance as a top concern for third-party risk management. So going to the third scenario now, your vendor could be slow to remediate infections. And as I said before, we know that things do happen on people's networks, whether it's a new vulnerability popping up or whether it's an existing vulnerability and a new instance of that showing up in someone's network. Things do happen. That's just the nature of security. There's no way in which you can prevent things from happening 100% of the time. But what organizations can do and what you should count on your vendors to do is to remediate issues as soon as they come up. So this is important because the longer issues linger on people's network, the more time an adversary has to go in and take advantage of it and take an action that could potentially lead to bigger problems on the network. So what you could do in your vendor contracts is to put in language that says that whenever there are security incidents, the vendor needs to contact you, and in the contract you can require that there be a threshold on how quickly the vendor should respond to new incidents that show up on their network. And really, what you see on the right here is a way in which you can use BitSight to monitor how quickly companies are resolving issues. And if you don't see that companies are quickly resolving issues, then you can go back to that contract and make sure that the vendor is actually following through on the commitments that the vendor made to you in the contract. And the last scenario, your vendor was breached, and this is, the worst thing that could happen in a vendor relationship. A breach has happened, and you weren't notified. And if you weren't notified, you don't really know the extent of the breach's effect on your own operations. Perhaps the breach only affected the vendor's other customers, but perhaps a lot of your own customer data was lost in the breach. If your vendor doesn't notify you and gives you additional detail on the breach itself, you have no way of figuring out what exactly was the impact on your organization from the breach. So one thing you could do is, again, this is something you can do in contracts. Put into your contract some language that says that if a breach were to happen, the vendor has to notify you in a certain period of time. This way, at least, you know what has happened and what steps you need to take to mitigate the outcomes. And the other thing is, going back to the previous slide, if the company has poor security and you're monitoring them on an ongoing basis and you see that their security posture isn't getting better or their time to remediate isn't getting better, it's only a matter of time before a data breach would occur. So perhaps it's time at that point to even cut that vendor off before a big breach happens and you have to deal with the repercussions. So with that, let's transition over to continuous monitoring because, for each of the four scenarios that we presented today, continuous monitoring is an important aspect to making sure that you're staying on top of the relationship with the vendor and to make sure that if things were to happen, if bad things were to happen, you have a way to stay on top of it and respond to it collectively with the vendor. So continuous monitoring is increasingly becoming the accepted practice across all industries. So if you look at the NIST framework for cybersecurity, NIST 800-37, it states that organizations have to have an ongoing awareness of information security vulnerability and threats. And this, the NIST language is pretty broad, and it talks about organizational risk decision making. And given that third-party risk is a critical component and a critical part of the overall risk that your organization faces, it's important that you implement the continuous monitoring that the NIST framework recommends. And specifically in the context of third party, they say that you need to have a comprehensive approach, and it should be integrated into the entire life cycle of the third party relationship. And we'll talk about some of the life cycle stages in the next slide. And you have to make the third party monitoring part of the ongoing monitoring that you do for the other types of risks that you have. And NIST actually recommends that you use automated data feeds to stay on top of third parties' security postures, because there's only so much you can do from a manual perspective in terms of making sure that you're covering all your bases when it comes to evaluating third-party risk. So if you look at this VRM maturity curve, this is basically telling you what percentage of companies are in each category in terms of the vendor risk management maturity. So it goes left to right in terms of increasing maturity. And if you look at the last bar on the right, that 10% bar, that is telling you the percentage of companies that are following a continuous monitoring approach using automated techniques to evaluate a dynamic environment. And those companies also report these results to the vendors and to other stakeholders within the organization itself, so that different stakeholders know exactly what's going on and what's the up to the minute status of vendor risk within the organization. And if you go, from there to the left, you see that a majority of companies are not there yet. 90% of companies are not in that right bucket. And interestingly enough, 38% have done the bare minimum, which is, identifying vendors and suppliers and nothing more. So if you're in the, leftmost bucket, you want to do everything you can to move over to the, the buckets on the right as soon as you can. And if you're already in the 25% or the 23% bucket, you should strive to incorporate some of these other processes that are in the categories to the right of them, so that your VRM program becomes the more mature variety in the marketplace. And this is a good way to look at how you can transform vendor risk management and get into that last level of maturity. So if you look on the left side, at the leftmost end, you see the different life cycle stages that a vendor would go through. So screening, onboarding, and monitoring. So these, screening is the stage where you sort of decide if you want to pick a vendor or not. Onboarding is the process through which the vendor becomes part of your everyday process, and then you need to monitor them on an ongoing basis as long as they are providing you services. So you can see what the existing processes are for each of those stages. So you do have subjective questionnaires, you have external audits, which could be expensive in that screening stage, and then all the way down in the monitoring stage, you can see things such as reporting to regulators or reporting to boards as far as the processes that you have now. And then on the right side, you see what are some of the things that BitSight can do for you in terms of streamlining those processes that you see on the left, and to make sure that your vendor risk management program is as comprehensive as possible, because we've heard over and over again from different people in the industry that they have limited resources, both in terms of manpower, money, time, in order to do vendor risk management at scale. And BitSight certainly brings in approaches such as continuous monitoring, alerting, ways to interface with your vendors within the BitSight platform that makes it really easy for you to stay on top of the risk that the vendors pose, and to make sure that your vendor risk management program is as mature as possible. And if you need more information on how to make your vendor risk management program even more mature, or if you're just starting out, what are some of the things that you should take into account before you put things into place. We have a variety of resources on our website that you can take a look at. You can go to bitsightech.com/resources and download this for free, and you can use this to structure your vendor risk management program better.
Great. Thank you, Matt. Very informative, and I know a lot of people appreciated those 4 scenarios you outlined. And we do have a bunch of questions that came in, so we'll get to those now. But just to specify, there are a copy of the slides available in the attachment and links section of this webinar, so you can grab a copy of today's slides in that section. Our first question is, how do you determine who are your critical vendors? Regulators are not clear in their description sometimes, and I'm trying to get a sense of who my critical vendors are.
That's a great question, and we know that some of the regulators are working on tweaking this definition a bit more. But in the meantime, if you go back to the page that I suggested, we do provide a good amount of information on who your critical vendors are and what you need to do with them. But to give you a few examples, someone like your payroll provider or your health insurance provider or your legal firm would fall into the critical vendor category. That's because you're sharing a lot of sensitive data with them. So sensitive data includes PII of your personally identifiable information, or PII of your employees or of your customers. And the type of organizations that I mentioned are organizations with which you do share that information. So those organizations will certainly fall into the critical vendors category. And that's sort of a broad set of examples across different industries. Now, if you're in a specific industry, obviously you can add additional items to that list. If you're in the, just to pick an example, if you're in the defense industry and you have a lot of, contractors and subcontractors, then some of the really sensitive designs and other things that you share with those are really important for your business and also for national security reasons. So some of those vendors will become your critical vendors. So there are some broad things that we can say and broad types of vendors that we can mention, but to really figure out who your critical vendors are, it's sort of industry specific and company specific. We can certainly help you identify those, working with you. But that's my high-level take covering all different industries.
Thank you, Matt. Our next question is, what kind of assessments should a buyer be doing for their vendors? Is there a standard that you recommend, such as ISO 27034 or a third-party code test? Kind of what are the standards that you recommend?
Absolutely, that's another good question. So the ISO standards, they're great in our opinion. They give good guidance for conducting vendor risk management. If you have questionnaires that you use, that's a good start. One thing you could do is you could compare the questionnaires to the questionnaires used by some of the leading firms in the financial industry, because the financial industry tend to be more evolved in this matter than others. So you can compare your questionnaires to the more advanced programs and see if you're covering the right things, and if you're not, what else you should add. In terms of other types of assessments, certainly if there are critical vendors, doing an on-site audit is a good practice that people follow. So that's certainly something you should have in your program. But really, those things cover the basis in a good way. But to bring in the continuous monitoring aspect, it's important to get periodic updates from the vendor in some form or another, especially if they are your critical vendors. And you can do that certainly with BitSight, and this is a BitSight webinar, so obviously I'm going to say that. But you can also have more periodic check-ins with your vendor to do exactly the same. And putting in some of that contract language that we talked about earlier can certainly put the impetus on the vendor to let you know when critical things change, so that you do get an ongoing insight into a particular vendor, even though it may not be as continuous as something that you would get with, say, BitSight.
Thank you. And I think you just did allude to this, Matt, but we have another question, and perhaps you can answer it from a different standpoint. What kind of assessment methods do you suggest to tailor to the size or certain risk introduced by a vendor? Would you recommend, for instance, simple questionnaires for those low-risk vendors and continuous monitoring for high-risk vendors who might have sensitive data?
Absolutely. I think the question, whoever asked the question started to answer their own question. For high risk vendors, you absolutely need the continuous monitoring aspect because they do have a lot of your data, a lot of sensitive data. So questionnaires and audits alone won't do, in our opinion. For low risk vendors, you don't even have to. We know of well established vendor risk management programs that don't even do questionnaires every year. They might do it every other year. And having but I should say, and having said that, it can be expensive from your end to do questionnaires even at a reduced frequency. There's a lot of time and human resources that you need to put in to do questionnaires. So if you tier someone into that low risk category, what you could do is you could get away with using a BitSight report on that company at whatever interval. Perhaps it's every 6 months, perhaps it's once a year, to get around the fact that you have to do a questionnaire. So I know I gave a pretty broad answer, but these are some of the approaches that we're seeing our customers take in terms of managing risk, both at the more critical side and the less critical side when it comes to their vendor ecosystem.
Great. Yeah, it's very informative. Thanks, Matt. If we had another question come in, what percentage of comprehensive security assessment or a comprehensive security assessment would be covered by the BitSight risk factors in the product?
That's a really interesting question. I'm going to say it's hard to answer and give a percentage. That's because the assessments and the assessment needs really vary from industry to industry. There are industries and type of vendors in terms of criticality where a BitSight risk assessment, BitSight report is the only thing you need to look at. But then there are other cases where the BitSight report might only cover a very small percentage of the overall assessment you need to do for a vendor. One of the things that we're doing is to actually map some of the BitSight controls that we have to existing frameworks such as NIST or PCI, so that when you do the assessments and you do use BitSight security ratings to do that assessment, you can clearly see what percentage of a certain framework or requirement such as PCI, which is a compliance issue, a particular vendor is satisfying by looking at their BitSight data. So there was a question about certification. So is there any intent to gather information about security-related certifications for certain companies in the future? It would be great to add some compliance-type metrics to go with the technical pieces. So what I just said in terms of NIST and PCI, certainly that is something we can tie in. In terms of looking at certifications, we don't have a plan to incorporate that directly into the product. We can certainly try to map to some of the ISO standards and specifications using what we see. But the certification itself is something, as far as we can tell, something that is complementary to what BitSight has. And there are certainly other things that are complementary, such as questionnaires or audits. So in terms of bringing a company's certification itself into the product, that is in our longer-term roadmap to in combination with some of the other things that are complementary to BitSight.
Great, Matt. I appreciate that answer, and really some great questions that have come in. We have time for just one last question. I think this is a really good one to end today's talk on. What is a good goal or metric to set for my vendor risk management program?
That's a really good question, and I think from an information security perspective, companies should strive to have vendors that are top of the class in terms of protecting their consumers' data, their customers' data. So when you roll out a vendor risk program and you look at your vendor ecosystem, I would say you should set the goal to say that in X months, 6 months or 8 months, or sometimes depending on how big your vendor ecosystem is, in a couple of years, I would like all my vendors, or in some cases all my critical vendors, to be in a certain category when it comes to information security risk. And we recognize that it's hard for all vendors to be equally secure across the board. So another approach you could take is I want all my vendors to be the best in their industry when it comes to my vendor risk program and what it looks like 2 or 3 years down the road. So you could start with something like a baseline security rating for all your vendors after you've tiered them, and you can set targets for that vendor population as a whole. Obviously, there will be variations from vendor to vendor over any given time period. But if you set something like an average rating or a median rating for your vendors in certain categories, certain levels of criticality, and set targets for improvement on those ratings, say improve by a certain percentage or a certain absolute amount in a certain number of months or a certain number of years, that is a good way to assess how quickly the various processes that you put in place to improve your vendors as part of your vendor risk management program, is that effective, is that not? So that's what I would suggest.
Thanks again, Matt. And thanks everyone for attending today's webinar. If you didn't get to ask a question, please email info@bitsightech.com, as it is here on the bottom left of this slide. Thanks again for attending, and have a great day.